What we have to do is create a better global system that is truly resilient and is not simply dependent on one or two countries to provide all their support. It's important to recognize what I call the dignity of difference. But it's also important for us to recognize the power of unity. There's a lot you can do from wherever you're sitting, from wherever you are. We can't take our prosperity for granted. We can't take our country for granted. We have to work at it. And we have to be prepared to contribute to it, to make a difference.
Hi, welcome to our podcast, The Zero Hunger Project. I'm your host, Suman Roy.
And I'm Stacey O'Neill.
And today we're going to talk about a topic that is near to and dear to many. It is the conflict, climate, and displacement, the global roots of hunger. And today we have with us Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Mr. Bob Rae. And I'm going to ask Stacey to talk a little bit about Ambassador Rae.
It would be my pleasure. Ambassador Bob Rae is a member of the Privy Council. He's a companion for the Order of Canada and the Order of Ontario and the King's Council. He's a Canadian diplomat and former politician who has served as the Canadian ambassador and permanent representative to the United Nations since 2020. Throughout his career, Ambassador Rae has held multiple leadership roles, including Premier of Ontario and interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, and has long been recognized for his advocacy on global humanitarian, Indigenous, and human rights issues. At the UN, the ambassador focuses on famine prevention and humanitarian access in conflict-affected regions, advocacy for displaced populations and refugee protections, holding nations accountable for weaponizing hunger, and supporting multilateral responses to food insecurity, poverty, and climate-induced crises. His work reinforces that hunger is often not just a resource issue, but a political failure, and that it requires coordinated global action rooted in justice. Ambassador Rae's deep Canadian roots, global presence, and moral clarity make his perspective invaluable to this conversation, particularly in helping Canadians understand that their country's potential to lead on food security at home and abroad.
Thank you, Ambassador Rae, for coming. And before we get into the conversation, I really wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for, and I'm giving a plug to my book, The Zero Hunger Project, for you doing the foreword for that book. It means a lot. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I'm delighted to support what you're doing. I think that your basic objective of trying to link up issues in Canada with global issues and try to let people know that what affects us here at home also affects us around the world. So it's not as if we're separate or apart from all that's going on globally. And I think your vision is a very, very important one.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
I have a lot of questions about this because food security is not necessarily my area of expertise. And you are the president of ECOSOC. And for listeners and for myself, we would love it if you could explain what ECOSOC stands for, what it does, what presence it has, what relevance it has.
Well, ECOSOC is a body that was set up by the world. And when we formed the UN in 1945, it's one of the charter bodies of the United Nations, like the Security Council and like the General Assembly. And the Economic and Social Council has a very busy job at the UN, which is basically to deal with all the range of social and economic issues that are facing the globe at the present time. So whether it's the SDGs or the food security issue, which is becoming more severe in many parts of the world, the broad workings of all of the agencies at the UN, which report to the Economic and Social Council. Tomorrow, we're going to be doing a major discussion on AI. So we look at economic issues, the impact of technology and what's going on around the world. Basically, sort of have a life that it doesn't last very long. My presidency only goes for a year, but we've tried to make the most of it in getting people to focus on the importance of these issues as we go forward.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So you mentioned briefly about the SDGs, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. All through our podcast, we've been talking about SDGs on almost every episode. How are we doing, especially when we're talking about SDG 2, the zero hunger?
Well, we've had lots of setbacks. I mean, I think the broad picture on the SDGs is when you look at it from the perspective of history, is pretty amazing. I mean, we've reduced hunger around the world quite dramatically since 1945, and there are many, many more populations like in China and India, in Brazil, and elsewhere, many other countries where food security has increased significantly compared to what it was. And, there were massive famines in India in the 1940s. There were huge challenges in China during the so-called Great Leap Forward, when we know there was serious lack of food at the time. We've seen many examples where if you can turn your economic and social system around, you can turn your food security around. The challenge we're facing now is particularly related to two issues. One is conflict, and the other one is climate change. And they are both having really making it more difficult for us to take things to the next level when it comes to getting rid of hunger everywhere, which is the objective of the goal. And I think it's fair to say that we now have several very severe crises on the hunger front, and they've been frankly intensified by the decision by the United States and many other governments to reduce their overall contributions to humanitarian assistance. And that's having a dramatic effect on the hunger situation. And plus the severity of some conflicts, Gaza, Sudan, the Eastern Congo, just to mention three, is really affecting negatively the health of the people who are living in those areas and their access to food.
So, Ambassador, you mentioned it, and going back to this, with everything that we are seeing in the US currently happening, maybe USAID, or what does that look like in the next 1, 2, 3 years?
Well, it's going to be very serious. I mean, we have to figure out a way to really reform and improve the global humanitarian system. There's active conversations going on now about how that can happen. What are the plans that need to change? And these will be very much part of the conversation at the United Nations with ECOSOC, frankly, over the next three months, because we are facing a series of crises in different parts of the world. And the hunger situation, the food situation, is extremely serious. And the American decision to withdraw money, it may be that they will have some second thoughts about that. We're not sure, but we can't count on it. What we have to do is create a better global system that is truly resilient and is not simply dependent on one or two countries to provide them with all their support. I think it's fair to say that the UN system became too dependent on the United States, and we now have to figure out a way to make sure that we're able to do things differently.
So what role do you feel that countries like Canada can play in fostering global stability, particularly around when you were talking about climate change and conflict?
Well, I mean, when you talk about, Stacey, talk about both those things, those are global issues, right? I mean, Canada can improve its own performance on emissions. We can improve our own performance on what we're doing, but we have to recognize that that really only covers less than 2% of the problem. We need to look globally at finding solutions to that. At the same time as we have to recognize that a lot of climate change is happening because the emissions have been building up over several hundred years. We are living with a lot of climate change now. So we need to build greater resilience, better infrastructure, better capacity to deal with changing weather and severe weather. And it is going to lead to a lot of movement of people because some parts of the world are becoming increasingly uninhabitable because of the heat. And that means that we are going to have to deal with the issue of displacement, which is another big issue that we've been looking at the Economic and Social Council over the last several months.
But these are huge problems, aren't they? I mean, like really big, severe. The average person, I don't think, understands the gravity of these situations.
No, I think that's true. And I think that for many people, it all seems very far away. But the one thing we've learned is that even problems that seem far away are actually very close. We are in Canada, and you in Scarborough, where you're located, where you're doing your great work. Scarborough receives thousands and thousands of immigrants every year, people coming from all over the world, and they are coming in, and the pressure is building to increase the number of people coming because of the circumstances that people are facing in their home countries. So we might think that these problems are far away, but they're not. They're actually very close.
You're absolutely correct. In our food banks, for example, we see more than 75% of our population coming in are less than 1 year in this country.
Well, and that's the issue too, right? Is that it's not like we don't suffer from food insecurity in Canada and that we've got it all figured out. And we have space for people to come in, we're also struggling here as well. So there's a balance that needs to be maintained.
Yeah, and I think the Prime Minister has indicated very clearly that he understands that. We have to be clear-headed about what we need to do for ourselves, and also what we need to do for each other. And having said that, I think it's also important to recognize that one of the reasons we need to keep on doing more with respect to our international support is because the level of insecurity grows in countries unless you deal with the problems closer to home. And so we have to look at, well, what are we doing about the conflict in Sudan? What are we doing about the conflict in Gaza? What are we doing about the conflict in Eastern Congo? What are we doing about the conflict in Venezuela? What are we doing about the conflict in everywhere? We have to respond to that.
And as I say, Ambassador, that nobody can build a wall that touches the sky, so we are in one world.
This is correct. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think we know it from the pandemic. We always want to know what the national response to the pandemic is, but we also need to figure out how do we support and sustain countries that are going through a really tough time because of the pandemic, because of climate change, because of conflict, understanding that the brunt of those costs is not borne by us. The main part of those costs is borne by those countries that are closest to the conflict. And we're seeing that all the time.
Absolutely. And so, Ambassador, Canada has a new Prime Minister now. Exciting. Now, as a Canadian ambassador to the UN, what are the most pressing global challenges you see internationally that Canada can contribute or address even more than we have been doing in the past?
Well, I think it's more a question of doing what we have been doing, but also doing it more in a more focused way, perhaps. I mean, let's look at both the economic and the social, as well as the political. The political gets a lot of the attention, but we need to understand that the political conflicts we see in the world today and the military conflicts usually have a huge social economic impact, but they also have complicated causes that we have to deal with. So, I mean, we really do have to look at how can we reduce the level of conflict in the world and make sure that the achievement of peace doesn't come at the expense of human rights or at the expense of social and economic progress. And then we also need to look at some of the major disruptors, technology, the climate change, dealing with displacement as a phenomenon that is only going to grow, increasing the level of understanding among Canadians about why things are happening the way they are, what we have to do about them, what's the practical approach, and also knowing that we're not going to do this by ourselves. We can't solve it all alone. It's not just about what is Canada doing. It's about what is the world doing and what are we doing to contribute to the world's efforts to deal with these issues.
How responsive is the United Nations as a governing body to addressing these issues? I know that there's been the UN Security Council structure has been criticized for being outdated. It was formed at the end of the Second World War. What reforms, if any, do you see are required to make the United Nations more viable to be able to deal with these ever-changing crises moving forward?
Well, I think the big reforms are, frankly, in our hands as a world, but the answers are really up to nation states. I mean, the fact is the Security Council doesn't work well because of the vetoes, A, and doesn't work well, B, because countries are not prepared to give the Security Council the resources it needs to solve problems. We're seeing that in Haiti as a classic example where the Security Council can't agree because of the disputes between the members of the Security Council about the level of support that's required to actually give the country the ability to fight gangs and to fight criminality, which is now taking over in a big way in Haiti. That's just one example. So better rules, more capacity to enforce whatever it is, whether it's a treaty like the climate treaty or whether it's the work of the Security Council, and really looking much harder at how we can create more momentum for common action. And that requires much greater willingness to contribute.
Fantastic. Ambassador Rae, you have spoken a lot and you have worked a lot around the Rohingya crisis in the past, and that's kind of really interests me a lot, and other humanitarian issues, of course. Now, what strategies can the UN and the member states adopt to better prevent and respond to such crises that keeps on happening over and over?
Well, this is a good example. I mean, the Rohingya crisis has been going on for a long time. I mean, it erupts every once in a while. It erupted in 2017. A million people left Myanmar and were forced out because of conflict, and are now living in the refugee camp in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. I think that it is a classic example of where the UN, the world, has not been able to respond effectively to Myanmar's crisis. You have a terrible dictatorship there. The military is running the country into the ground. And you have a problem with the way in which minorities are treated in that country. And the Rohingya are the worst treated of all the minorities in Myanmar. I wrote a report on this several years ago saying, here's what we can do, and tried to galvanize a bit of action on the part of the Canadian and other governments. But I have to say that I don't think we've all been that effective in making the deep-seated changes happen, largely because of the conflict that's driven by the self-interest of the generals, what's called the Tatmadaw, the army of the country, which really has taken a very, very negative view about the rights of the Rohingya and other ethnic groups in the country.
This seems, for somebody who doesn't talk this language all the time, as a problem within a problem within a problem within a problem. These problems, we talk about them, then we talk about, in order to fix these, we have to change our policies, we have to change the infrastructure, we have to treat women better, we have to include youth in the conversation, we have to reduce climate emissions. I mean, it's overwhelming to even talk about, which I think is why the average person can't possibly talk about this stuff, because there's no sort of place to lay your head, if you will, with regard to, there's no respite for this. How do you deal with that as a public servant and as somebody who's involved in these very high level, incredibly important international conversations?
Well, I think the hard part is that the world has been like this forever, right? We didn't know about it. I mean, we've known less about it, and the world all seemed very far away. And you would have as I mentioned, the mass famine in India and Bengal in 1943, and millions of people died. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible famine. But a famine is a human creation. Food shortages are a thing, but food shortages don't have to turn into a famine. Famine has to do with the political organization of how you distribute food. And this is what most people in Canada would have had no idea about that. They would have said, we don't know anything about it. Would have received no newspaper coverage. Nobody would have paid attention to it. Now, because of social media, we know more. But a lot of what we know on social media is also noise. There's a lot of noise that accompanies the facts. And the noise tends to make people feel there's nothing I can do about this. It's too complicated. It's actually not that complicated. There are everywhere in the world, there are differences of opinion. Sometimes those differences of opinion lead to conflict and to fighting and to fights. We know something about fights in Canada. We've had our share of fights historically. And thank goodness we have fewer fights, even though we seem to be having a few these days. But we don't. I mean, they're all democratic and they're kind of within the boundaries of what's normal. But it's hard. I mean, it's difficult for people to get their heads around this. But I think, in fact, we're a very well-educated country. We have people from all over the world living here. I think most Canadians understand what's happening. They're ready for a government to engage with them about what can we do. But it's also important to be realistic about what we can do. We can't solve many of these problems overnight. We can't solve them on our own. We have our own problems to deal with. So there are many things that should temper our aspirations. And I said, when you look at things broadly speaking, the world is getting more prosperous. Broadly speaking, we've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Broadly speaking, we've reduced the level of food shortages, but there are still some critical problems remaining. And I think those problems remain a real challenge. But I think it's important for Canada and Canadians to stay engaged on how we might be able to do that.
And how do we do that? How do we keep them engaged?
Well, the first one is I think we have to take dealing with conflict more seriously globally. We can't afford to be isolationist about these things. We have to look at what measures are required to reduce the level of conflict. I think we have to be looking at reforming the whole UN peacekeeping system. which luckily the UN now has to do because of the money crisis. And that, I think, will lead to some better approaches to how we can use our diplomatic and other efforts to try to reduce the level of conflict. The second one is to make sure that the distribution of food globally is taking place in a much more seamless way. And while the United States, I would say, erratic decisions have created problems, we can deal with those, and we need to deal with them.
Ambassador, you talked about Canada quite a bit. So in Canada, how do you think we should balance our commitment to multiculturalism with its national increasing polarized global landscape and even Canadian landscape, in the matter of fact?
Well, I mean, I'm not one of those people who says, when you come to Canada, you don't bring anything with you. I'm a realist. The fact is that when the English and French came to Canada, they brought their conflicts with them. That's why we had so many military battles in the 17th century, the 18th century. And that's just, that's life. But I do think that we need to be thinking as a country, yes, it's important to recognize what I call the dignity of difference, but it's also important for us to recognize the power of unity. We're all Canadians. When you come to Canada, you're joining something, you're joining a country. And I think it's important as Canadians, we take some of those common values that we've developed. Many of them are expressed in the Charter, but the Charter was really an expression of values that already existed. We have a strong legal system. We have many ways in which many things in Canada, which we can be very proud. And I think we have to keep on reinforcing the things we have in common rather than the things that divide us. And I think that's something which is critically important for all governments to remember.
What is it that you think that people aren't talking about enough?
Well, just how damn lucky we are to be Canadians. I mean, we live in a great country. I mean, when I travel around the world and I go to different places and see the way and listen to the stories that people tell us in the work that I do at the Economic and Social Council, we all have to understand the reason that there are so many people who want to come here is because it's such a great place. And we need to, I think, talk each other up a bit more. But I see that as happening now. I think, ironically, that one of the things that some of the things that President Trump has said, we're not a real country, we don't really exist. Even Mr. Blanchet from Quebec made some comments that I think were pretty uninformed and very unfortunate about how, we're an artificial country. No, we're not an artificial country any more than any other country is artificial. The idea that the only thing that, is worthwhile fighting for is ethnic nationalism strikes me as pretty grim view of the world. And anyway, as we know very well, the idea that there's ethnic purity in any country is nonsense, because people travel, people move, people come back and forth. And you find in every part of the world that countries that like to say, oh, we're all the same people, we all speak the same language, we all practice exactly the same religion. It's not true. They don't. And I think we should be very proud of the fact that we have this diversity. But I also think we need to work on our prosperity. We need to work on the economy, the economic decisions we have to make. And I think we have to work on the things that bring us together, the unity, the common humanity, the shared values, the shared geography, the land that we love. And I think it's important for us to reinforce some of those civic values.
Absolutely. In my textbook in high school, I remember Canada was referred to as an ethnocultural mosaic.
Oh, wow.
It was in contrast to, they were talking about sort of the melting pot idea of the United States, where you become an American first and then you're like an Italian afterwards, or wherever your country of origin. In Canada, you're an Italian Canadian, because we're all part of a mosaic. And that always stuck with me, because I was in high school like quite some time ago and I still remember that. But I like that idea.
That makes sense. So, Ambassador, you worked a lot with youth around, and from the time I've known you. Now, is there any advice that you want to give out, one or two advice for the youth who wants to come in the public service or even international affairs? We are in Canada, we are starting off a World Food Forum chapter for Canada with the FAO. And I've got a lot of youth who's going to be listening to this and joining that movement. Any advice for them?
Well, my advice is roll up your sleeves and get involved. There's a lot you can do from wherever you're sitting, from wherever you are. I've been amazed at the UN with the number of visits we've had from young people, high school students. I've just got a message from somebody saying, can you speak to a grade 5 class in primary school? I've said, well, okay, I can. We'll figure out a way to do it. But it's fascinating because that's such a strong feeling of engagement. And yet at the same time, I think people are looking for, well, what can I do? And I think the answer is do stuff in your school, get involved, work with others, join organizations that are helping to make a difference, do some research on those organizations, find out if they're really doing what they say they're doing, and hold everybody to account and hold your governments to account. And I think that's something that people need to keep on thinking about. It's possible to be engaged and want to do stuff for your own community. And it's also possible to be thinking about what's going on around the world, because this is the world you will be living in. I say to young people, for longer than I will, you will need great stewardship and great engagement on your part in order to make a difference.
Has there been a lot of change in discussion with regard to national pride, the upswell of national pride that's happened in the last little while in the face of what's happening in the United States? I mean, have you seen any change in the discourse around that?
Tonight, I'm going to be giving a talk to one of these elbows up gatherings where we talk about, where we are and what we're doing. And I think it's important to take the momentum and the feeling that's there and try to channel it in a positive way, to channel about what can we do as a country. I think the Prime Minister's talking a lot about our economy. How do we want to build our economy? What do we want to do with what we have? We really can't take the world for granted. We can't take our prosperity for granted. We can't take our country for granted. We have to work at it. And we have to be prepared to contribute to it, to make a difference. And sometimes that, not to be resenting things like, oh, I have to pay taxes. You say, yeah, we all pay taxes. And we do it. We should do it with pride and frankly, with gratitude, because we're doing it to build a country. And we're in a position to do that. And yet me is not going to do it for us. We have to think more broadly than we have been. And we have to think more in a more creative way about how we can really build something that's even better than the country that we received from our parents and our grandparents.
Ambassador, I was a few days ago, I got an email from this young lady out in Ghana and asking me to go over there and address a bunch of youth on global hunger and SDG 2. And it really fascinated me how they have really and it is youth working with the youth, got together, getting organized, learning, and trying to figure out what is next steps, which blew my mind. But in Canada, when I'm looking at in the developed countries primarily, I still don't see the youth as much activated, especially around these SDGs and these kind of topics, as I would have loved to see. Is there any advice for the youth and I know you have a great advice that you gave, a roll up your sleeve, but anything more that will get them out of their chairs and get them to work?
Well, I think it's about curiosity. It's about really being curious about the world we're in. It's about taking a special interest, learn another language, broaden your mind, think more about what's going on around you. Of course, we don't want kids to be, to not enjoy themselves, but really think carefully about what can we do to make the world a better place. And I think it's important for us to know that the technologies that we have are actually bringing us together. It is very possible to talk to classrooms. I can talk to classrooms anywhere in the world from where I sit and have a conversation with people from all over the place. And that's a wonderful feeling. And but then you have to say, okay, what are we doing with that technology? How are we taking advantage of it? And I think we need to reinforce the importance of empathy, of solidarity, of feeling for other people, really understanding what's happening with them. And there's so much we can learn now from films, from documentaries, from information that's widely available on the internet. And again, do that as a thing to challenge. Is that information correct? Am I getting the right information? Is it telling me what I need to know? We have many, many ways of finding things out. Artificial intelligence can tell us in 30 seconds what are the 10 countries that are the most affected by famine and hunger today. You can get that by just asking any one of your chatbots to tell you what's going on. But then you got to decide, so what am I going to do about that? How can I impact that? Technology doesn't answer those questions. That comes from your heart and your brain and your body and what you're prepared to do. And I think it's important to remember that.
I'm interested to know what your best case scenario is, what the best case outcomes are for your tenure at ECOSOC, for the work that's being done right now.
I think to be realistic, I think we've done a good job of really discussing the issues and really bringing them to a wider audience. I'm look forward to keeping on doing that in a variety of ways. And then I think the other aspect of what we need to do is then really see whether the UN as a system can change. And I don't think the change will end in a couple of months. I think the change is going to take time, but you got to start. And I think I will be much happier once I'm convinced that the UN is really ready to embrace change. And I think we'll get a feeling for that in the next few months.
What's it going to take to convince you that they're capable of change? What are you going to need to see?
Well, whether they always say the old expression, when the rubber hits the road. Okay, so what are you going to do? How are you going to reorganize yourself? How are you going to create a humanitarian system that is clearly more efficient and more effective than the one that we have now? And I think evidence of that will have to start now, very quickly.
And do you think this appetite of change is there across the UN?
Well, I don't know if the appetite is. I know the necessity is. And usually the necessity leads to an appetite because the organization can't remain the way it is without serious change. In order to survive, it's going to need major reform, major improvements, and major changes. And I think that verdict is very clear. The executive board of the UN, all of the agencies, all of the heads of agencies are going to be are in Copenhagen as we speak, having an executive meeting, and they'd better come out of that meeting with some very clear ideas as to how they're going to move forward.
Well, I mean, the point of the UN has changed, hasn't it, since its inception? And it needs to change with what its mandates are moving forward.
I don't know if its mandate has changed. I mean, I think its mandate is still set out in the charter, and it's set out pretty clearly in terms of peace and security, human development, and human rights. I think those are still very clear as objectives. How you do it and the institutions that are required to make that happen, I think that can change, and that is changing.
This question, I think, Stacey, I'm going to ask you to ask because this is your favorite question to ask.
What is the question of what is nobody asking you? Is that the one?
Yes.
Yeah, I always ask people this question because particularly people like yourself who've been interviewed 6 squajillion times. What is the question that nobody ever asked you that you wish somebody asked you? And with regard to your work, with regard to projects you're working on, anything like that, is there something that you wish people would ask you to talk about more?
You know what? Not really. I mean, I have to say, I think I've been asked pretty well every question. I'm not sure there are too many that I haven't been asked, but I think that it's funny the way that works. I think there's a tendency on the part of questioners to look for the negative. And the question that the reason that I kind of start out talking about the positive things that are happening is because they often don't say, well, what's good about what you're doing or what's good about what's happening in the world. And I think I've tried to answer that myself by talking about the progress that we've made, the things that we've been able to do, and how, frankly, when you look at Canadian history, how we've actually made a big difference in the world and how, in many ways, we continue to make a big difference in the world.
I love that. And it will be something I will be doing moving forward, particularly because it is an overwhelming issue. All of these things are so overwhelming. They seem insurmountable in some cases. So it's good to look at the positive. It's good to look at work that's already been done and successes we've already experienced. And that's a good reminder for everybody, I think.
That's awesome. Ambassador, thank you for your time. This
Thank you
was
so
great. I
much.
hope we didn't go over.
No, it's fine. It's good. Nice to see you. Nice to be with you. Good luck with the podcast, all your podcasts going forward.
Thank you. And we will bug you again with other questions when we have.
I'm quite confident you will. Don't worry.